Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Sascha Meinrath. I'm the Palmer Chair in Telecommunications at Penn State University and the director of XLab. And I'm not even here to see myself because I am here to continue a conversation that I've had the singular joy of having with Matt Rantenan, a new Ashoka Fellow and a long time friend and co-conspirator on a variety of broadband interventions spanning all sorts of different domains. And so I could go on and on and on. We could fill the entire 30 minutes we have with all of the accolades and different things that Matt has done. He serves some very important positions at the National Congress of American Indians, has been on a number of committees and task forces with the FCC, with the White House. He is also the director of technology for Tribal Digital Village. He serves on the board of the American Indian Policy Institute. You're getting a sense of just a small slice of all of the myriad things that Matt has done over the last quarter century in this domain. And that quarter century is actually where I want to start the conversation, which is to say, Matt is a wonderful individual who has slogged through decades of being a vanguard individual, a vanguard leader in a space that only now is beginning to take off. And Matt, I'm going to pass the baton over to you with this simple question to get us started, which is, how has the last 25 years been? Walk us a little bit through that history and what it's been like being kind of at the forefront of the tribal broadband and the digital sovereignty movement.
Thank you, Sascha. It's great to be here. It's great to be an Ashoka Fellow. I'm looking forward to what the future holds in this space. Very excited. So, yeah, the last 25 years, eh? So it's been a long road, and I think the realization of the lack of services in Indian country became much more apparent when the internet started to become a thing, right? So early on, so in 2001, Southern California Tribal Chairmen's Association was awarded a massive grant and from Hewlett Packard, and it was a digital village grant. So they attempted to do a number of things with that, resource programs, after school programs, potentially building an internet network. And I came on in October of that year to help them realize that the money that they had was a great amount of money, but it was far too little to do the things that they had aspired to do with it.
This sounds like a common theme.
Oh, so common. I mean, $1 million sounds really cool until you realize how much $1 million really isn't when you are running something like telecommunications, something like building communications infrastructure for your community, because you've been left out of that equation by incumbents and governments and such from the day one start time. So, I mean, reality is there were no services. Even copper telephone lines were one of those things. There's the joke, and I'm gonna catch a joke from our friend Jeffrey Blackwell at National Congress of American Indians. He says, you used to know when you were in Indian country when you hit the potholes on the road, and when there started to be more potholes. But now you're in Indian country when you drop cell service, and even prior to to active cell phone service, you knew that you were in Indian country when it rained, because the copper telephone lines shorted out in the hot areas, because the hot areas, all their casings cracked and they started to short out. So, I mean, it's been a struggle since day one. Been a realization. It's been a take inventory. It's been a, where do we actually sit in this, space of telecommunications? And so, it was really a realization period 25, 23 years ago of what we were missing out on. And, then the government went live with grants.gov, and all grant applications had to be online. And that was the slap in the face.
Mm-hmm. And what's interesting, because I feel like at this point in time, we're still realizing that both there's more money than we ever thought possible and less money than we desperately need in these sectors. You've been at the forefront, not just of raising awareness around these issues, but of also like garnering the resources that are available today. And I was hoping you could talk, because you're both a practitioner. You've climbed around on roofs, you've dug trenches, you've built things, and you're also a policy maven, which is to say, you do a great job of passing. You dress up nice and you come to DC and you tell people what for. And that's a rare dual skill set to bring to this table. Could you talk a little bit about what you've done at the FCC with the White House and et cetera over the years?
I think it's a huge advantage to have practical experience, have been in the dirt, have built the towers and built the communications infrastructure, because then you can speak from actual experience. When you step inside the Beltway, you're often speaking theoretically about, what ifs and, hey, if we put some money over here, would this change the landscape, et cetera? And I can step into those conversations and, diffuse what $1 million will actually do in what, these grand aspirations of it's millions of dollars versus millions of dollars gets you about 1.5 miles underground fiber in California today. So, things have changed obviously over the last 20 years in prices, but, I think that me being involved with the Native Nations Broadband Task Force at the FCC, with the Communications Security, Reliability, and Interoperability Council at the FCC, during the time I was involved, I think was really impactful to the rulemakings that were happening at the time around spectrum usage, around funding opportunities, around access to subsidies and programs that tribes just didn't have access to. And, as I started to build the network with the team at Tribal Digital Village Network, Southern California Tribal Chairmans, we ran into a wall. Hey, how come we don't have this funding and this group over here has that funding? Shouldn't we have that same access? Or, boy, we could sure use some spectrum to be able to, to allocate, some wireless connections in this kind of an arena. And how come we don't have access to that? What's missing? Where is it missing? And, let's figure this out. So, I mean, my first step into DC was for the E-rate programming. Why couldn't tribes get access to E-rate funding? And I tapped into my former life of being a graphic designer. I created a brochure that said ... and tribal communities, and I walked around with that brochure in DC to senators and congresspersons and the FCC, and explained the story. And we got an exception to the rule and became eligible for E-rate. And I believe it was just last year, the Federal Communications Commission, so 21 years in the making, changed the rule so tribes could self-designate their own libraries.
Right. And for those that don't follow this particular area, E-rate is the subsidy program that has basically networked our schools and libraries across the United States with connectivity. And to be clear, tribes were left out of that until folks like Matt, and Matt was probably first amongst them, went to DC and was like, hey, what about tribal community centers? What about tribal libraries? They had just been overlooked in the designation of which entities were eligible to receive that funding.
Yeah. So the DC meetings, and actually, the state capital meetings too, Sacramento, because I'm based in California, I often find that tribes are left out. Now, if it's intentional, that's really unfortunate. Going to war. If it's unintentional, then let's just educate and make sure we're included. And sometimes it's just, there's a lack of education around tribes in policymaking, and they just don't have a schematic of, if we flow money, here's what that looks like. And they don't, recognize tribes as the sovereign nations that they are.
So if we could jump forward a little bit into, I think, what is an incredible, valuable resource, and riffing off of the Jeff and now your joke around losing connectivity as soon as you step over onto the res. Could you talk a little bit about one of the big battles that you really spearheaded, which was the battle to get access to a small band called the 2.5 gigahertz band, and why this battle is so important today?
Sure. So spectrum, so wireless spectrum is a very valuable tool in communications. We use it for our cell phones every day. We use it for everything that's wireless in your household, everything that, there's communications systems that run wirelessly outside that you don't see. There's a variety of things, and they're very valuable chunks of this spectrum that allow you to build infrastructure and to support a community in these efforts. And one of them is FM radio, but then also there's broadband usage of similar spectrum as well. But so I'll rewind to the point where we got this priority. Native American nations believe that the spectrum over their tribal lands should be their resource. And I don't disagree with that at all. We all believe that tribes should have access to the spectrum over their tribal lands, because incumbents and everybody else doesn't intend to use that to serve tribes. So why shouldn't tribes be able to use that to serve themselves and be a natural resource over their own space? However, the FCC is controls that resource for the federal government and makes billions, if not trillions of dollars for the federal government in auction to communications companies, et cetera. But in, don't even know the year, but we were able to create what's called a tribal priority window for FM licensing for FM radio stations. And tribes, if you think about it, without internet, FM radio and terrestrial radio is a primary source of communication, albeit one directional. It is a primary source of communication for a community, for emergency situations, etc. So tribes wanted to apply for radio stations. FCC opens windows at certain periods of time. It's very competitive. It's very expensive. So in the work that we've done in DC, a number of organizations, Native Public Media, National Congress of American Indians, of which I was a part of all of them at the time, were able to apply what they call a tribal priority window, which is tribes get access to that spectrum. They don't have to wait for a license window to open. And in competition, the tribe wins over their own land. And it's free. So so we were able to over double the number of FM radio stations in the United States serving tribes, and really, solve some communications problems in some of those regions. Now, cool enough, we had an opportunity. The FCC was pulling back a spectrum that was being misused, and they were going to reallocate it for a different use because the primary experiment that they did with it didn't work. So they pulled back that license to bring it into their control, and then they were going to go out and auction it. Well, in the process of doing that, a lot of folks advocated for that license to be used by tribes. And the cool thing was we already had language for a tribal priority window built into this FM rulemaking. So folks inside the FCC were able to extract that language and place it on 2.5 gigahertz, which is a very functional space in telecommunications infrastructure. So for tribes to get a license for 2.5 gigahertz over their tribal land, there was a process to opt in, which was an application process, but it was a somewhat simple application process to opt in for tribes, and they could actually be a license holder of.
And I think the FCC was thinking like a dozen or 24 tribes would apply, right?
There was a formal, I believe there's a formal letter that went out that said we expect at least 12 applications because there are roughly 12 tribal telecommunications companies that exist. So they were expecting the telcos to apply for it for their resources, and they had over 400 or almost 500 applications. And then they had, I think 300 tribes got 400 licenses for their tribal lands. Some of the tribes have multiple land allocations that aren't contiguous. So in that effort, yourself, Jeffrey Blackwell, Irene Flannery, we hit the pavement, or the internet, as it were, to engage tribes to talk about this opportunity and what it meant. It's not just a tool for building broadband as a puzzle piece of the actual network, but tribes, being sovereign, have sovereign land. They cannot collateralize their land to borrow money to build infrastructure for communications. An FCC license is a collateralizable, that's not a word, an object that you can collateralize. And it is, it is now a tool in the financial toolbox as well as the network building toolbox. So they can now use this to borrow money to build their network. And so it's extremely valuable on two fronts for tribes. I think you and I touched 189 tribes in that process, in a very short window.
It was a sprint, as it were. There was not a lot of time to get folks up to speed on this. And I feel like that too is one of the conundrums, is that there's sort of this mythical notion amongst the federal government that capacity exists, technical acumen, wherewithal that needs to be built. We're going to get to that in just a moment. Moving forward some more, I want to talk about this tribal broadband build-out fund, because back when Secretary Holland was Congresswoman Holland, you had worked a lot with her team, with Warren's team, et cetera, bringing them up to speed on the actual need within Indian country for dedicated funding, for a priority funding to meet some of the needs of tribes. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So it goes back even earlier than that. So when let's see, 2016, looking at the Obama's administration, I was working with a CTO for a period of time on a project to identify what's the missing link. So we identified 8,000 missing middle miles. So that's the fiber optic network that connects your community to the rest of the world's backbone, so that you can see all the resources of the internet. So you can build a really sweet network in your community, and then there's the world's network, but you can't get from your community to that world's network without what they call middle mile fiber, middle mile connectivity. So there were 8,000 missing miles in the lower 48 states to roughly 320 reservation spaces. So we knew there was a deficit in dollars just in connecting us to the rest of the world, let alone, connecting every home. Then we did some work, your team involved as well, to figure out, how much money is it going to cost to build out a network for every single tribe. 560 some nations at the time. We're now at 574 nations, federally recognized. And that, ballpark in 2016 was in the $8 billion range, not including that middle mile connector. So, fast forward to COVID, boom, supply chain destroyed, et cetera. You have this deficit of 11 to $14 billion. But early on, when we deciphered the ballpark that we were in, the National Congress of American Indians and other Native American organizations started asking for a foundational investment in Indian country in the tune of $1 billion. And they had been asking that for, a number of years before, the congressional folks started to grasp onto this possibility. And then we were looking at stimulus funding and different things happening. And finally, in the interaction with, those leaders in our U.S. government that, care about Indian country, we finally got enough traction to get dollars into the legislature that allowed tribes to get access to that foundational $1 billion. We've seen, and it's wonderful to work with folks when they're eager to learn and eager to reach out about a community that, we have expertise in, because you find that they're compassionate, but they just don't get it. They don't live there. They haven't grown up there. Some of them have, and that's the real benefit with Deb Holland, is that, she comes from Laguna Pueblo, and she knows what it looks like on the ground and how it is to be there. So very exciting to have, Indians in federal government. As that money started to flow, we're very excited about $1 billion hitting Indian country, but we knew roughly the ballpark of deficit. And that first round of tribal broadband connectivity program funding, $5.8 billion were requested for $1 billion fund. And that was only from 305 of the tribes, not all of the tribes. So clearly we are well within that ballpark of 8 billion, if not now with, the escalation of pricing, just demand on product, et cetera, and the changes in, just general changes in dollars. We've seen in inflation, we've seen, that move into the 11 to $14 billion solution.
So we've got what? A 100-year history of spectrum marginalization. You fought and won a precedent, at least, for tribal prioritization of spectrum. We've got this multi-hundred-year infrastructure deficit, and we now have, I guess, a grand total of about 3 billion, modest funding to address this 11 to 14 billion minimum need. Now I want to talk a little bit about the deficit of expertise, of networking capacity, of, in essence, what you are working on right now with the tribal broadband boot camps and et cetera. How do we ensure that Indian country has the capacity to make best use of these assets, however modest and insufficient, that are already becoming available?
Yeah, so that, I mean, in the last 23 years with Tribal Chairmen's Association, that has been the big realization is there's not a pool of individuals that have this level of experience or any level of this experience, even from a beginner space, to draw from. So Indian country, we're operating on the reservation, which is most of the time, 90% of the time, that's a very remote location. The community network needs to be built in that remote location. And the resources for just humans, job workforce development, the resources are not there. Some tribes are huge, like Navajo, Cherokee, and a few others. Some tribes are really small. California has some very small tribes due to the structure of the federal government's reservation planning system to dissolve them. They've done a very good job in reducing populations. So some of those populations don't have enough people to be able to support this. So how do we do this? How do we find more folks from our communities to be able to do these projects that now demand, skill sets of climbing towers, all levels of construction, but then also the technical aspects of things of networking and routing and management, network operations, administration, and things like that. And we just don't have the human resources that are trained that way. So, over the years, we've looked for an aptitude and, a desire to be involved with technology and, be interested in this. I mean, it's a really cool space. You're not just an IT person sitting at a desk. You're an IT person at the top of a tower aiming an antenna. You're an IT person that's out in the field on the mountaintops looking at your reservation and the beautiful surroundings that you are lucky enough to live in. I mean, it's just really amazing opportunity to work at home for a very decent career wage and be able to support your community in building out technical infrastructure. So, there are some appealing parts of it, but what we found in the 20 plus years that I've been doing this is that the 16 to 25-year-olds don't know what runs the internet, right? They know how to use the phone, they know how to use the PlayStation, the Xbox, the laptop, the iPad, etc. But that's all user interface experience. That's not creator. And so, we are shifting Native Americans to become providers, not consumers, right? So how do we do that with a lack of people? And that is, it's on the ground, face-to-face, hands-on training, and getting trained by people that look like you. So, we've started the tribal broadband boot camps. My friend Christopher Mitchell and I officially started this in July of 2021. And so we are coming up on 3 years next month. And we have done 14 full 3-day events and a couple of 1-day events with the National Tribal Telecommunications Administration or Association. We've had, an overwhelming success. We've had 72 tribes, individual tribes attend, and we've now had over 400 participants in 14 events. And we just finished one last week that was held at my house in Southern California. I have some land, so we were able to get outside and play around. So this experience is something that a lot of the folks that come from the different tribes are just getting started with. So they don't have any experience at all with what anything looks like. Like, what does a communications tower look like? How does fiber hang on telephone poles? What does it look like when it goes underground, et cetera? And, we've done the work at this location to be able to have a broadband playground. So we've buried a 1/4 mile of fiber. We have 3 We have 3 situations where you can go into a splice case and actually splice fiber together and create a network. We can break the network, we can fix the network, we can troubleshoot the network, we can reach out to a tower and build a wireless communication system. We can, play with the electronics that manage the fiber and look at different, opportunities to push different levels of speeds and mess around with pathways and management and, statistics and et cetera. So um, we're really interested in folks getting their head around this in this experience, both at beginner, intermediate and advanced level. We have a lot of repeat attenders. And I always ask the question, like, all right, so you've been to 13 boot camps now. Why are you coming to the boot camp number 14? And that answer is always really amazing. It's like, well, halfway through these boot camps, I was at this level and I was able to ask these questions based on my understanding. I went home and put all that to practical use. And then I ran into some questions that, like, okay, I'm now advancing my technology understanding, and I think I should be able to do these things, but I'm going to go ask folks that already do these things and find out, is this something new? What to do. So they come back with a whole nother layer or level of questions that oftentimes their peers have experience in and answer, and not necessarily those of us that started the boot camp. And the absolute best byproduct of this entire thing is there is a network of 400 people that are talking to each other about building tribal broadband, and they're all out there building tribal broadband for their communities. And I don't have to be the middleman because I am a bottleneck when it comes to, hey, Matt, who do I talk to? Hey, Matt, who do I talk to? Hey, Matt, who do I talk to? I've gotten now
And that,
400 people together, and I'm very excited that there is this now human network of people sharing experiences, opportunities, good vendors, bad vendors, good contractors, bad contractors, good consultants, bad consultants, and how to manage things and how to do stuff and solutions. It's phenomenal.
yeah, and that national network is quite active. I actually had to just turn off the sound to my phone because people are posting right now as we speak
Yeah,
on that Discord channel.
I saw have a note. Yeah, yeah,
So, and that's, I think, really points towards the future. And I'm going to start transitioning us to the Q&A. We've had a couple questions come in. I would encourage folks to ask more. I'll try to synthesize as best I can on the fly here. But let's assume success for a moment. What do we do with these networks? I saw like Simon and Stephanie were talking about everything from sensor networks to environmental stewardship to legal stuff. Like what does it mean to have both tribal sovereignty, digital sovereignty, and the capacity to build, maintain, own, and expand this infrastructure?
yeah. So, I mean, it's so unbelievably important for every piece of infrastructure that supports a community, not just the communications bit, for people-to-people communications, but if you're managing a water system, if you're managing electrical grid, if you're managing a green energy solution for power, if you're managing wildfire, and I'm trying to touch on all the things in the questions, but if you're managing wildfire, just observation and management and emergency preparedness, all of those things are enhanced by broadband. Every single one of those things works better with broadband. So water, the worst thing you could have with water is losing water, right? And then not having enough water. And so there's maintenance of water flow and water condition and quality and such that can be happening in real time with electronics that are communications and broadband. You have the ability to manage and control and make sure that you're not polluted by outside influence if you have the digital sovereignty over your communication systems, communications to infrastructure resources, communications to people, communications to access to information and resources. And tribes should be thinking about an end-to-end solution of management and ownership, because they are sovereign and they have a lot of valuable information and valuable practices that should be contained and protected, and not abused and used for nefarious purposes.
So we have a couple of offers here in the Q&A of like, so, and I think this is right, Donnie, that the government funding is focusing on capital expenditures, and that leaves a big open question of kind of what to do next. So how do people tap into this, especially those that are kind of want to be in alliance, want to be partners? How do people get involved in this kind of intervention?
Yeah, so that's been the hardest part for me over the last 20 plus years is how to bring outside resources, non-tribal resources in to support tribal efforts. I am poor at managing interns. I am poor at managing an administrative assistant. I am poor at managing technical folks that want to step into a space and contribute because they don't know the environment, right? So it is really it's a catch 22. Like, you bring somebody in from the outside, the first thing you have to do is educate them on the environment itself and where they're at. Like, a sovereign nation is different than this little town down the road. So how to operate, cultural respect, sensitivities and things like that, and just how to manage yourself in a tribal community. And then we can talk about, like, okay, how do we move forward with how can you contribute to, like, building out the network, et cetera. I mean, we've got engineers that offer their services on a monthly basis from IETF and IEEE and a bunch of different folks, and I don't know how to put them to use because they want to code, and my network uses zero coding. So I think that we've designed it to be a plug and play network that you don't have to have the experience of coding routing protocols and such on such a an advanced level, and by design. And so when we get access for people like that, we don't know how to put them to work. So I would love to work with Ashoka to figure out a better way for us to integrate that outside support, because there are a lot of folks that want to contribute, and I just don't know how to make that work well.
So in the last minute or two here, I want to kind of touch on what Maria is bringing up in the Q&A in terms of like lessons learned, but I want to maybe change that a little bit to say, what's the future look like, right? So we have like this Afro-futuristic, epitomized maybe by like Black Panther, right? This utopic kind of like techno advanced space. What does the tribal futurism look like within a technical interconnected, like how do we generalize this beyond a single tribe doing a single thing and talk about what can we do at network at scale, not just in
Right.
the US, but globally?
Well, I mean, some of the byproducts of the boot camp have been revealing a lot of forward thinking about how do we keep it indigenous, right? So how do we have a network, and I'm just gonna generalize, but a network in Northern California that serves its community, that has data resources that are valuable to their community, that has network running, operating protocols and systems management and water utilities management. How do they have that all stored? I mean, does that go into the generic cloud that's non-tribal, or is that housed locally on a micro data center or even a full-fledged data center at their region? And then how do you back that up so that you don't go to the non-tribal cloud? How do you do that? So in the boot camps, there's actually been discussion between Northern California and New York and Southern Arizona to replicate each other's storage capacities so that they can draw on an indigenous sovereign space to store their network operations, operating software, a saved backup of that in case they have an outage or a failure of their system, and they can automatically draw from one of those other two tribal networks to be able to do that. And then, talking about saving, proprietary data for tribes to be able to house that at locations that are on sovereign lands so that they can't be, affected by just the general data miners of the world, and how to build those protections and the cybersecurity around that. But then also how to create, virtual private networks between tribes and create a layer, a peering fabric, if you will, a layer for indigenous communities to work and trade and create. I mean, even the community of Puuno Waimanalo, they have a physical trade environment for things like vegetables and things like that. But I know John Kealoha Garcia is thinking about, how do we do this in the internet? How do we do this in a peering fabric between indigenous nations where we trade resources online, and we have an operating space that isn't part of the rest of society, and keep it indigenous. And that goes global. I mean, TVNet is part of Pacific Wave, which is around the entire Pacific Rim. So you could effectively build that peering fabric to the Maori, to the Aboriginal, Australia, to the Pacific Islands and such.
So in 30 seconds, I know you're working on a book chapter over these issues. You've got a Center for Tribal Digital Sovereignty that you're in the midst of standing up. You're doing a lot of work for that future. And you've got this Waskawiwin group that you've been building out as we speak. Give everyone something that a thread to pull on as they leave this conversation.
Okay, excellent. So Waskawiwin, quick touch, waiting on the IRS to finish the identification of it as a 501c3, so that we will have a 501c3 that is directly aligned with the tribal broadband boot camps and the efforts that we're doing there. Currently, we're using Institute for Local Self-Reliance as a fiscal sponsor. American Indian Policy Institute at Arizona State University and the National Congress of American Indians has started a Center for Tribal Digital Sovereignty, of which you and I are on the AIPI board. I am at National Congress of American Indians, co-chair of Tech and Telecom Subcommittee. So we are fleshing out the people infrastructure in both of those organizations to be able to then build a layer on top of that Digital Sovereignty Center and create a coalition of like-minded and vetted and trusted operators in the space that support tribes, both native and non-native entities, to be a part of this, to be able to support Indian country and building out their communications features.
Excellent. Any one of these topics we've touched upon could be a whole webinar unto itself. Thank you, Matt. This has been really thrilling to hear all this. I know it's sort of like drinking from a fire hose. And I look forward over the ensuing years to further collaboration and conspiring on these issues. So thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for taking the time.
Yeah, thank you for your time today. And we're looking forward to collaborating in the greater Ashoka Fellowship in the near future. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Cheers, everyone.